There comes a moment in every life when the past refuses to stay buried, when old wounds resurface with the force of divine reckoning. For 70-year-old Sister Clara, that moment arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon when tiny knuckles rapped against the convent door. 6-year-old Tasha stood on the doorstep, her dark eyes wide with grief. "My mom just died," she whispered, clutching a worn teddy bear. Sister Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. 40 years ago, she had turned away another desperate mother and child, a decision that haunted her sleepless nights ever since. With no family to claim Tasha, the elderly nun faces an impossible choice. Take in this grieving child, or repeat the mistake that has tormented her for decades. But what happens when saving one child means confronting the ghost of the one she failed to save? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass bells of St. Agatha's convent chimed 4 o'clock as Sister Clara McKenna knelt in the chapel, her weathered hands folded in prayer. At 70, her knees protested against the cold stone floor, but she had endured this ritual for 43 years. The worn prayer book in her lap held more than scripture. Pressed between its yellowed pages were wildflowers from her childhood. A garden in County Cork, dried violets that her mother had helped her pick the summer before she left home forever. The convent had been Clara's sanctuary, her penance, her prison. Built in 1892 by Irish immigrants who understood the weight of starting over, its Gothic arches and stained glass windows filtered the afternoon light into jeweled patterns across the stone floor. Sister Mary Catherine, the elderly Mother Superior, often said the building itself was a prayer made manifest in brick and mortar. Clara's cell was sparse, a single bed with a wooden cross above it, a small desk where she wrote letters to the few remaining members of her scattered family, and a narrow window that looked out onto the convent garden. The garden was her special charge, rows of vegetables and herbs that fed the small community of 8 nuns who called St. Agatha's home. She had coaxed life from that soil for decades, her hands growing more skilled with plants than they had ever been with people. The other sisters respected Clara's quiet nature. Sister Anne, barely 50 and still young enough to laugh easily, managed the convent's modest finances with the precision of a bank clerk. Sister Rose, who had taught at the parish school for 30 years before arthritis forced her retirement, spent her days mending altar linens and humming hymns from her childhood. Sister Margaret, the cook, could make a feast from donated vegetables and day-old bread, her kitchen always warm with the scent of fresh biscuits and hope. Mother Superior Mary Catherine was 82 and had known Clara longer than anyone else in their small community. She remembered the night Clara had arrived, 27 years old, with haunted eyes and a suitcase that held more grief than belongings. Mary Catherine had never asked about Clara's past, understanding that some wounds needed silence to heal. But she had watched Clara tend the garden with an intensity that spoke of deeper hungers, for redemption, for purpose, for the children she would never have. The financial reality of their situation weighed heavily on all of them. Donations had dwindled as the neighborhood changed around them. The parish school that had once provided their primary income now struggled to keep its own doors open. They supplemented their meager resources by selling Clara's vegetables at the farmer's market, their small booth a beacon of fresh hope among the vendors hawking everything from handmade soap to political buttons. Clara's own family had never quite understood her calling. Her brother Thomas, 10 years younger and successful beyond their parents' wildest dreams, sent dutiful Christmas cards from his law practice in Boston. He had visited only twice in 4 decades, both times for funerals, first their mother, then their father. Each visit had been stilted with unspoken questions and careful conversations that skirted around the real reasons Clara had chosen this life. The truth was wrapped in shame so deep it had calcified around her heart like scar tissue. Clara had come to the convent not from divine calling, but from human failure, fleeing a moment of weakness that had cost more than she could bear. To remember, she had built her life of service as a monument to that failure. Each prayer an apology, each act of charity an attempt to balance scales she feared would never be even. Now, as the rain drummed against the chapel windows, Clara found herself thinking about children again. It happened sometimes, especially during the long winter months when the garden lay dormant and her hands had too little to occupy them. She would wonder about the children she might have had, the small hands that might have learned to plant seeds beside her, the voices that might have filled the quiet spaces of her carefully ordered days. The knock at the convent door came as she was finishing her evening prayers. Sister Anne answered, her footsteps echoing through the corridor as she approached the heavy wooden door that separated their world from the bustling street beyond. Clara heard voices, Anne's gentle inquiry, and something else, smaller, desperate. "Sister." "Clara," Anne called, her voice carrying an unusual urgency. "Could you come to the door, please?" Clara rose slowly, her knees protesting after the long kneel on stone. She smoothed her habit and walked toward the entrance, her soft-soled shoes silent on the polished floor. The other sisters had gathered in the corridor, Sister Rose peering over her reading glasses, Sister Margaret wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron, Mother Superior emerging from her office with the measured pace of someone accustomed to handling crises with grace. At the door stood a child, a little girl with dark skin and enormous eyes that held too much understanding for her young face. She was soaked through, her thin jacket no match for the October rain. In her arms, she clutched a teddy bear that had seen better days, its brown fur matted and one eye hanging by a thread. "My mom just died," the child said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her small hands. "The lady at the hospital said to come here, said you help people." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The child's words echoed across 40 years, carrying with them the phantom scent of jasmine and the memory of another desperate voice in the dark. Her hand gripped the doorframe as her heart began to race, each beat a reminder of the night she had failed so completely that she had spent the rest of her life trying to atone. "What's your name, sweet child?" Mother Superior asked, stepping forward when Clara remained frozen. "Tasha Marie Williams." "I'm 6. The girl lifted her chin with a dignity that broke Clara's heart. "My mama said if anything ever happened to her, I should find the nuns. She said nuns take care of people who got nowhere else to go." Sister Anne immediately brought towels and dry clothes, while Sister Margaret disappeared into the kitchen to prepare warm milk and sandwiches. The other nuns bustled around Tasha with the efficiency of women who had spent their lives in service to others' needs. But Clara stood motionless, seeing not this child but another, a boy with frightened eyes and his mother's desperate hands clutching his shoulders. "Sister Clara," Mother Superior said gently, "why don't you help Tasha get settled while I call?" "The authorities? This child needs care, and we need to follow proper procedures." Clara nodded, forcing herself back into the present moment. She knelt beside Tasha, her movements careful and deliberate. The child smelled of hospital antiseptic and rain, of grief too fresh to fully comprehend. "That's a beautiful bear," Clara said softly, her Irish accent still faint after all these years in America. "What's his name?" "Mr. Patches," Tasha replied, holding the toy closer. "Mama gave him to me when I was little. He keeps the scary dreams away." Clara felt something crack open in her chest, a place she had kept sealed for decades. "Well then, Mr. Patches is very important indeed. Shall we find him a warm place to dry off?" As she led Tasha toward the guest room they used for visiting families, Clara caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. The face, looking back, was lined with 70 years of living, framed by the white wimple that had hidden her graying hair for 4 decades. But in her eyes, she saw something she had not glimpsed in years, a flicker of the woman she had been before grief taught her to build walls around her heart. The child's presence filled the quiet convent with something electric and unsettling. As Clara helped Tasha into dry clothes and combed the tangles from her hair, she found herself moving with a tenderness she had almost forgotten she possessed. Each gentle touch was both blessing and torment, awakening maternal instincts she had buried so deep she had convinced herself they no longer existed. That night, after Tasha had fallen asleep in the narrow guest bed with Mr. Patches clutched against her chest, Clara sat in her cell and stared at her prayer book. The pressed flowers her mother had helped her gather seemed to glow in the lamplight, reminders of a time when her life had been full of different possibilities. Outside her window, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean for whatever tomorrow might bring. Clara pressed her hand against the cool glass and wondered if this child's arrival was coincidence or providence. In her heart, she knew the answer, even as she feared what it might cost her to face it. The ghost of her past had arrived in the form of a 6-year-old girl with trusting eyes and a broken teddy bear, and for the first time in 40 years, Sister Clara McKenna allowed herself to hope that redemption might be more than just a word whispered in desperate prayers. The morning brought news that Clara had both expected and dreaded. Mrs. Henderson, from social services, arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, her briefcase bulging with forms and her manner professionally sympathetic. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the sort of person who had chosen her difficult profession because she genuinely cared about the children caught in the system's web. Tasha has no immediate family, Mrs. Henderson explained as they sat in the convent's small parlor. Her mother was a single parent, estranged from her own family. The father is listed as unknown on the birth certificate. We're still investigating distant relatives, but for now, she's a ward of the state. Clara listened to the official language that reduced a child's life to bureaucratic terms, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Tasha was in the garden with Sister Anne, helping to gather the last tomatoes of the season. Through the window, Clara could see the child's small form bent over the plants, her voice carrying faintly as she chattered to Mr. Patches about the vegetables they were finding. "How long might the investigation take?" Mother Superior asked. "Weeks, possibly months. In the meantime, Tasha will need temporary placement. I have several good foster families on my list, though finding someone who can take her immediately." "She can stay here," Clara said quietly. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her paperwork, surprise flickering across her features. "Sister, I appreciate the offer, but convents aren't licensed for childcare. There are regulations, background checks, home studies, then help us navigate them," Clara interrupted, her voice stronger now. "This child has just lost everything. She needs stability, not another upheaval." The social worker studied Clara's face, perhaps recognizing something in the nun's intense focus. "It would be highly irregular. The church would need to approve it, and there would be significant paperwork. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny?" Clara felt her chest tighten. Scrutiny was the last thing she wanted. Too many questions about her past, too many forms that might uncover the truth she had spent decades trying to forget. But looking out at Tasha in the garden, watching the child's careful attention to each plant, Clara knew she could not let this opportunity slip through her fingers like the last one had. "Yes," she said simply, "whatever it takes." That evening, after Mrs. Henderson had left with promises to explore the possibility, and Tasha had been tucked into bed with a story about St. Francis and the animals, Clara found herself alone in the chapel. The weight of the day pressed down on her shoulders as she knelt before the altar, her prayer book open to a page marked with a piece of newspaper so old it had yellowed around the edges. She had not looked at the clipping in years, but her fingers found it now with the muscle memory of old grief. The headline, dated October 15, 1983, read, "Mother and son found dead in abandoned building." Below it was a grainy photograph of a young woman with dark hair and desperate eyes, Maria Santos, 23 years old, who had knocked on this very convent door on a night much like the one that had brought Tasha to them. Clara remembered every detail of that October night 4 decades ago. She had been the youngest sister then, barely 30, and still raw with her own wounds. The knock had come at midnight, urgent and desperate. Maria had stood in the doorway holding her 5-year-old. Son Miguel, both of them shivering in clothes too thin for the autumn cold. "Please," Maria had whispered in accented English. "My son, he is hungry. We have no place to go. The men, they are looking for us. Please, just for tonight." Clara had seen the fear in the woman's eyes, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting pursuit. She had also seen something else, a darkness that spoke of danger, of complications that could bring trouble to their peaceful convent. The other sisters were asleep, and Mother Superior was visiting family in Ireland. The decision had been Clara's alone to make. "I'm sorry," Clara had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't. It's not safe. There's a shelter downtown, on Maple Street. They'll help you." Maria's face had crumbled, but she had not argued. She had simply gathered her son closer and disappeared back into the night, swallowed by shadows and rain. Clara had watched from the window until they vanished around the corner, then had returned to her cell and tried to pray away the sick feeling in her stomach. 3 days later, the newspaper had arrived with its terrible headline. Maria and Miguel had been found in an abandoned warehouse, victims of hypothermia and starvation. The shelter on Maple Street had been full that night, the article noted. They had been turned away there too. Clara had never told anyone about Maria's visit. She had buried the newspaper clipping in her prayer book and carried the weight of her decision alone for 40 years. Every night since then, she had prayed for forgiveness. But forgiveness felt impossible when she could still see Miguel's frightened eyes and hear Maria's desperate plea. Now, staring at the faded photograph, Clara felt the familiar knife twist of guilt in her chest. But something else stirred there too, a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. She would not make the same mistake twice. She would not let fear and caution cost another child their life. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the photograph. "I was young and scared and selfish, but I won't fail again. I promise you, I won't fail again." The next morning brought Tasha's first full day at the convent. Clara found the child in the kitchen. At dawn, sitting at the scarred wooden table with Mr. Patches, watching Sister Margaret prepare breakfast. Tasha's hair was uncombed, and her eyes were puffy from sleep, but she had dressed herself carefully in the clothes they had found for her. "Good morning, little one," Clara said softly. "Did you sleep well?" Tasha shrugged, a gesture too adult for her 6 years. "Mr. Patches had bad dreams, but Sister Margaret gave him some warm milk, so he feels better now." Clara understood the language of childhood trauma. How feelings too big for small hearts got transferred to beloved toys. How comfort for a treasured bear was really comfort for the child who held him. She pulled up a chair beside Tasha and accepted the cup of coffee Sister Margaret offered with a meaningful look. "Would you like to help me in the garden today?" Clara asked. "The plants need someone with gentle hands to help them get ready for winter." Tasha's face brightened. The first real smile Clara had seen from her. "Mama had plants on our windowsill. She said they were like friends that never talked back. The simple observation pierced Clara's heart. She saw so much in this child, resilience wrapped around profound loss, intelligence that would need careful nurturing, and a capacity for love that had somehow survived tragedy. Looking at Tasha, Clara felt something she had not experienced in decades, the fierce, protective instinct of someone who had found something precious that needed defending. As they worked in the garden that morning, Tasha chattering to Mr. Patches about the different vegetables and asking endless questions about why plants needed both sun and water, Clara made a silent vow. Whatever it took, paperwork, interviews, scrutiny of her past, she would find a way to keep this child safe. The ghost of Maria Santos seemed to hover at the edge of her vision, no longer accusing but waiting to see if Clara had learned. From her failure, if 40 years of penance had taught her the difference between caution and cowardice. That afternoon, when Mrs. Henderson called to say that the church was willing to consider the convent as a temporary placement pending proper licensing, Clara felt something shift in her chest. The ice that had surrounded her heart for 4 decades began to crack, letting in both hope and terror in equal measure. She was being given a second chance, not just to save a child, but to save herself. The wooden cross above Clara's bed had been carved by her father's weathered hands 60 years ago, each groove and curve shaped with the patient love of a man who understood that faith required something tangible to hold on to. He had given it to her the night before she left for America, pressing it into her palm with words she could still hear in his lilting brogue. Remember, Clara girl, that love is not something we keep, but something we give away. Now, watching Tasha sleep in the narrow guest bed with Mr. Patches clutched against her chest, Clara felt the weight of her father's wisdom. The child had been with them for 3 days, and already the convent felt different, not just occupied, but alive in a way it had never been during Clara's decades of quiet service. Clara studied the photograph through the locket's small window. A chubby infant with Tasha's enormous dark eyes, wrapped in a yellow blanket, and smiling with the unconscious joy of someone who had not yet learned that the world could be dangerous. The woman who had taken this picture, who had chosen to carry it close to her heart, had loved this child with the fierce devotion that transcends circumstances. "What about the father?" Mother Superior asked gently. "Unknown." Linda never spoke. About him, according to the neighbor, it was just the 2 of them against the world. Tasha was in the garden again, her daily refuge among the plants and growing things. Clara watched her through the parlor window as she chatted with Mr. Patches, creating elaborate stories about the adventures of vegetables and the secret lives of earthworms. The child had a gift for finding wonder in small things, a resilience that spoke to careful nurturing despite difficult circumstances. The foster home visits had been disasters, though Mrs. Henderson tried to present them diplomatically. The Johnsons were a well-meaning retired couple who had raised 5 children of their own, but their house felt sterile to Clara, full of white furniture and rules about indoor voices. Tasha had been polite, but withdrawn during the visit, answering questions in monosyllables while clutching Mr. Patches with the desperation of someone expecting to be separated from everything familiar. The Garcias had been warmer, a younger couple with 2 children already, but their home buzzed with the controlled chaos of modern family life. Television always playing, children rushing between activities, conversations conducted in the shorthand of people too busy to slow down. Tasha had seemed overwhelmed by the noise and motion, seeking corners where she could retreat with her bear. "None of them feel right," Tasha had confided to Clara that evening as they prepared for bed. "They're nice people, but they don't need me the way you do." The observation had struck Clara with its simple accuracy. She did need Tasha in ways she was only beginning to understand, not just as an object of care, but as a catalyst for parts of herself that had been dormant for decades. The child's presence had awakened something maternal and fierce in Clara, a protective instinct that had been buried under layers of guilt and self-imposed penance. Father Miguel had arrived that week for his monthly visit, the elderly priest, who had known Clara since her first years at the convent. He was nearly 80 now, his steps careful on the worn stone floors, but his eyes remained sharp with the wisdom of someone who had spent 60 years listening to confessions and offering absolution. "So," he said, accepting the cup of tea Sister Margaret offered with shaking hands, "I hear we have a young guest who has captured hearts." Clara felt herself flush under his knowing gaze. Miguel had been her confessor for decades, the repository of her guilt and shame, the gentle voice that had consistently offered forgiveness she could never quite accept. He knew about Maria Santos, about the newspaper clipping, about the weight Clara carried. "She's a special child," Clara said carefully. "Intelligent, resilient. She's been through so much loss." "And you?" Miguel asked. "How are you handling this unexpected blessing?" The word blessing caught Clara off guard. She had been thinking of Tasha's arrival in terms of second chances and redemption, but blessing suggested something freely given rather than earned through penance. "I want to adopt her," Clara said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I know it's complicated, my age, the church's policies, all the practical considerations. But Miguel, she belongs here. She belongs with us." Father Miguel studied her face with the attention of someone reading scripture, looking for deeper meaning in familiar text. "And what does Mother Superior think of this plan?" "She's supportive, cautiously. She understands that this is—" Clara paused, searching for words that could encompass the complexity of her feelings. "That this is something I need to do. Need or want?" Miguel's question was gentle but precise. Clara considered the distinction. Want seemed too simple, too selfish for what she felt. Need carried implications of desperation, of emptiness that required filling. Neither word captured the sense of rightness she felt when Tasha's small hand slipped into hers, or the way the child's laughter seemed to restore something vital that Clara had not realized was missing. "Both," she said finally. "I want to be her mother, and I need to prove to myself that I can protect someone who needs protecting." Miguel nodded slowly. "The sins of the past do not disqualify us from the graces of the present, Clara. God does not keep score the way we do." That afternoon, Clara found herself teaching Tasha to read, using the simplified Bible stories that Sister Rose had illustrated with watercolor paintings. The child was quick, her finger following words with growing confidence, her questions probing deeper meanings with the fearlessness of someone still young enough to believe that all mysteries could be solved with enough curiosity. "Why did Jesus have to die if he was good?" Tasha asked, her small face serious as she studied a picture of the crucifixion. Clara felt the familiar weight of theological questions that had no easy answers. Sometimes good people suffer not because they deserve it, but because that's how love works in a broken world. Jesus died because he loved people so much he was willing to take their pain on himself. Like how my mama got sick taking care of me when I had pneumonia last winter. The connection surprised Clara with its simple accuracy. "Yes, sweetheart, exactly like that. Love makes us willing to suffer for the people we care about." Tasha nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. She turned the page to a picture of the resurrection, Jesus emerging from the tomb with rays of light surrounding his figure. "But he didn't stay dead, right? That's the important part?" "That's the most important part," Clara agreed. "Love is stronger than death. It finds a way to continue." That evening, as Clara helped Tasha with her prayers, The child included her mother in the litany of people she asked God to bless. "And please take care of Mama in heaven, and tell her that Sister Clara is taking good care of me like she would want." The simple words felt like absolution in a way that decades of formal confession had never achieved. Clara tucked the locket under Tasha's pillow, a tangible connection to the love that had brought this child into the world and into Clara's. Who care? Outside the window, autumn was deepening into winter, the garden preparing for its season of rest before spring's resurrection. Clara felt herself on the edge of a similar transformation, the dormant parts of her heart beginning to stir with the possibility of new growth, new life, new reasons to hope that love could indeed triumph over the failures of the past. The photograph had been hidden in Clara's personal effects for 40 years, tucked behind her father's wood-carving tools in a box she rarely opened. Maria Santos smiled up from the faded image, a formal portrait taken at some happier time before desperation had driven her to knock on convent doors in the middle of the night. She wore a white dress and held a baby who must have been Miguel, her face radiant with the uncomplicated joy of new motherhood. Clara had found the photograph among the items returned to her after that terrible October night in 1983. Somehow, in her terror and confusion, Maria had dropped it near the convent door. Clara had discovered it the next morning, sodden with rain but still recognizable, and had kept it all these years as a reminder of her failure. Now, holding it with trembling hands, she saw not condemnation but something else, a mother's love, preserved in silver and paper, waiting for the right moment to inspire redemption. The bureaucratic machinery of child welfare ground slowly forward. Mrs. Henderson brought weekly updates on the licensing process, each visit revealing new requirements and complications. The fire marshal needed to inspect the convent's safety systems. The health department required documentation of food preparation procedures. Social services needed background checks on every sister, interviews with church officials, and detailed reports on the convent's financial stability. "I won't lie to you, Sister Clara," Mrs. Henderson said, during a particularly difficult meeting. "Adoption by a single woman of your age faces significant obstacles. The courts prefer younger parents, two-parent households, traditional family structures, and the church's involvement adds another layer of complexity." Clara felt each word like a physical blow, but her resolve only strengthened. "What do I need to do?" "Beyond the paperwork, you'll need a strong advocate, someone with legal experience who can present your case persuasively. The system is designed to protect children, but sometimes it doesn't recognize unconventional solutions that might actually be in a child's best interest." Clara's thoughts turned immediately to Thomas, her younger brother, who had built a successful law practice in Boston. They had spoken perhaps a dozen times in the past decade, their conversations stilted with the weight of unspoken history and parallel lives that had diverged so completely. He had visited only for their parents' funerals, each time seeming more like a stranger wearing their father's eyes. The decision to call him felt like stepping off a cliff into uncertain darkness. Clara had spent 40 years avoiding the scrutiny that contact with her old life might bring. But as she watched Tasha in the garden, teaching Mr. Patches the names of different flowers with the patience of a natural teacher, Clara knew she would risk anything to keep this child safe. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening, after the other sisters had retired to their cells for evening prayers. Clara sat in Mother Superior's office, her hands shaking as she dialed the number she had memorized but rarely used. "McKenna Law Associates," a professional voice answered, though it was well past normal business hours. "Thomas, please. Tell him. It's his sister Clara." The pause stretched long enough that Clara wondered if the connection had been lost. Then Thomas's voice came through the line, deeper than she remembered but carrying the familiar inflection of their shared childhood. "Clara, is everything all right? Are you—" "I need your help," she interrupted, the words rushing out before her courage could fail. "There's a child, Thomas, a little girl who needs me and I need her. But the system, they want to take her away, place her with a traditional family. I want to adopt her, but I need someone who understands the law." Another long pause, filled with the weight of 40 years of careful distance. "Clara, are you telling me you want to leave the convent, after all this time?" "No," she said firmly. "I want to bring her into this life, raise her here, where she's already begun to heal. She belongs with us, Thomas. I know it sounds complicated." "Complicated doesn't begin to cover it," Thomas said, but his voice had shifted from surprise to the analytical tone she remembered from their youth, when he would tackle problems with methodical determination. A 70-year-old nun wanting to adopt a child she's known for weeks. "Clara, the practical obstacles alone." "Will you help me?" she asked simply. The silence stretched between Boston and the convent, across miles and decades of separation. Clara found herself holding her breath, waiting for the answer that would determine whether her second chance remained possible. "Tell me about her," Thomas said finally. Clara felt something loosen in her chest. She began to speak about Tasha, her intelligence, her resilience, the way she found joy in simple things despite profound loss. She described the child's questions about faith and death, her careful way of building trust, her capacity for love that had somehow survived tragedy. "She draws pictures," Clara found herself saying. "Every day she draws pictures of the convent, of all of us working in the garden or preparing meals together. She's creating a family from what she found here, Thomas. How can I let someone tear that apart?" When she finished, Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I'll need to research the legal precedents, consult with colleagues who specialize in family law. This isn't my usual area of practice. But Clara—" His voice softened with something that sounded like the brother she remembered. "I need to ask why this matters so much to you. In all the years since you entered the convent, you've never asked me for anything. Why now? Why this child?" Clara's hand tightened on the receiver. The truth hovered between them, 40 years of carefully guarded secrets pressing against the boundaries of a phone conversation. How could she explain about Maria Santos, about the newspaper clipping, about the weight of a decision that had cost 2 lives and shaped every day since? How could she make him understand that this was not impulsive charity, but necessary redemption? "Because I failed someone once," she said finally. "Failed them completely, and 2 people died because of my cowardice. I won't fail again, Thomas. I can't." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way their conversations had never been. Clara waited for questions she was not ready to answer, for the lawyer's instinct to probe deeper into motivations and history. Instead, Thomas said quietly, "I'll catch the next flight to Chicago. We'll figure this out together." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of family loyalty that had survived decades of distance. Clara felt tears she had not shed in years slip down her cheeks as she thanked her brother and hung up the phone. That night, she sat with Tasha during the child's evening prayers, listening to the litany of gratitude that had become their nightly ritual. "Thank you, God, for Sister Clara and Sister Margaret's cookies and Mr. Patches and the garden," and Tasha paused, her small face thoughtful. "And for bringing me somewhere I belong." Clara tucked the child into bed, smoothing the covers around her small form with gestures that felt like benediction. "Somewhere I belong." The phrase echoed in her mind as she returned to her own cell, where Maria Santos's photograph waited on her nightstand. "I'm going to do it right this time," she whispered to the image. "I'm going to choose love over fear." I promise you that. Outside, her window, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, covering the sleeping garden in pristine white. Clara watched the flakes drift past the glass and felt something shift in her heart. Not the melting of ice, but its transformation into something clear and flowing, ready to nourish new growth when spring came again. Clara's childhood diary had been written in careful script by a 16-year-old girl who still believed that dreams could be planned like garden plots, with neat rows and predictable harvests. The leather binding was cracked now, the pages yellow with age, but the words remained vivid. Someday I'll have 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, and we'll live in a cottage by the sea with roses growing over the doorway. I'll teach them to bake bread and plant flowers and sing the old songs Mama taught me. She had found the diary while preparing for Thomas's visit, tucked away in the same box that held Maria's photograph and her father's woodcarving tools. Reading her younger self's innocent hopes felt like examining artifacts from a different civilization, a world where love was simple and loss was theoretical, and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten story waiting for a happy ending. Thomas arrived on a Thursday morning, looking older than his 60 years, but still carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to solving other people's problems. His hair had gone completely silver, and lines mapped the corners of his eyes, laugh lines, Clara noticed with surprise, suggesting a life that had included joy despite the serious nature of his work. "You look good," he said simply, embracing her in the convent's entrance hall. Different than I expected. Clara wondered what he had expected. Perhaps the hollow-eyed young woman who had fled to America 40 years ago, carrying secrets too heavy for her 27-year-old shoulders. The years had changed her, she supposed, weathered her into something more solid and enduring. "Come meet her," Clara said, leading him toward the garden where Tasha was helping Sister Margaret harvest the last of the winter squash. Thomas watched through the kitchen window as Tasha explained to Mr. Patches the importance of selecting only the ripest vegetables, her small hands gentle but sure as she examined each squash for signs of readiness. Sister Margaret listened with the indulgent attention of someone who had discovered an unexpected gift late in life. "She's remarkable," Thomas said quietly. "I can see why you've grown attached." During lunch, Tasha peppered Thomas with questions, delivered with the directness of someone too young to understand social conventions. "Are you really Sister Clara's brother? How come you don't live here too? Do you know how to plant tomatoes? Why do you wear such fancy clothes?" Thomas answered each question with the patience of someone who had raised children of his own, his manner easy and warm, in a way Clara had not expected. She learned that he had 2 daughters, both grown now, with families of their own, that his wife had died 3 years ago after a long illness, that he had been thinking about retirement and what to do with the rest of his life. "I was good at being a father," he told Tasha when she asked if he missed his children living far away. "It was the part of my life I was proudest of. But children grow up and make their own lives, which is exactly what they're supposed to do. That doesn't mean you stop loving them or wanting to protect them." That afternoon, while Tasha napped with Mr. Patches, Clara and Thomas walked through the neighborhood, past the small houses and corner markets that had become Clara's world. She found herself telling him about the daily rhythms of convent life, the satisfaction of growing things, the deep contentment she had found in a life stripped of complexity and ambition. "I thought you were hiding," Thomas said as they paused beside a small park where children played on swings and slides. "All these years, I thought you had retreated from life because it had hurt you too badly." "Maybe I was," Clara admitted. "But hiding and healing aren't always different things. Sometimes we need to step away from the world to understand our place in it." And now, Clara watched a young mother push her daughter on a swing, the child's laughter bright in the crisp November air. Now I think I understand what I was healing for. All these years of peace and prayer and growing things, maybe they were preparation for this moment when I could offer something real to someone who needed it. That evening, the health episode came without warning. Clara was helping with dinner preparation when the pain struck her chest like a fist, radiating down her left arm with frightening intensity. She gripped the counter, her vision blurring. At the edges, her breath coming in short gasps that felt insufficient. Sister Margaret noticed first, her cry of alarm bringing the other nuns running. Sister Margaret noticed first, her cry of alarm bringing the other nuns running. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face pale with concern as he helped Clara to a chair and loosened the collar of her habit. "Call an ambulance," he said, quietly, his fingers finding Clara's pulse with practiced efficiency. This could be a heart attack. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur of sirens and medical equipment, Thomas holding her hand while paramedics worked around them with calm urgency. Clara found herself thinking not of death, but of Tasha, of the child waking to find her gone, of dreams deferred once again by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The emergency room was controlled chaos, bright lights and urgent voices and machines that beeped with mechanical insistence. Tests revealed not a heart attack, but severe cardiac arrhythmia, her heart struggling to maintain its normal rhythm under the stress of recent weeks. "You're exhausted," the cardiologist explained, a young woman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Your body is telling you to slow down, to reduce the stresses in your life. At your age, this kind of episode is a warning that shouldn't be ignored." Clara felt the bitter irony of the situation. Just when she had found something worth living for, her body was reminding her of its limitations. The adoption process would be complicated enough without adding health concerns to the mix of obstacles. Thomas stayed with her through the night, dozing in the uncomfortable hospital chair, while monitors tracked her vital signs. In the early morning hours, when the hospital settled into its quieter rhythm, they talked about their childhood, about their parents, about the paths their lives had taken since Clara left Ireland. "I never understood why you became a nun," Thomas said quietly. "You were the one who loved children, who talked about having a big family. It seemed like you were choosing the opposite of what would make you happy." Clara stared at the ceiling. Tiles, each one identical in its institutional blandness. How could she explain that happiness had seemed like a luxury she could not afford, that penance had felt more necessary than joy? "I was running from something," she said finally. "Something I thought would destroy me if I let it catch up. But maybe God knew I would need these 40 years of preparation for what was coming next. And Tasha is what was coming next. Tasha is my chance to prove that all those years meant something, that I learned how to love properly while I was learning how to serve." The next morning brought Tasha to the hospital, clutching Mr. Patches and wearing the worried expression of someone who had already lost too much to feel safe about temporary separations. Clara felt her heart settle into a steadier rhythm the moment the child climbed carefully onto the hospital bed. "Are you going to be okay?" Tasha asked, her small hand cool against Clara's forehead. "Sister Margaret said your heart was sick, but that the doctors could fix it." "I'm going to be fine, sweetheart," Clara said, meaning it more than she had when the doctors had offered the same assurance. "But it means I have to be more careful, take better care of myself so I can take better care of you." Tasha nodded solemnly. "Mr. Patches says he'll help watch over you. He's very good at that." Looking at this child, who had already learned to carry grown-up worries with such grace, Clara felt her determination crystallize into something unshakable. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, legal, medical, or bureaucratic, she would find a way through them. Some loves were worth any risk, and this child had awakened in her a mother's fierce protectiveness that no amount of institutional resistance could diminish. The DNA test results arrived on a grey December morning, delivered by Thomas with the careful precision of someone who understood that some revelations change everything. The manila envelope felt heavier than its contents should warrant as Clara turned it over in her hands, her name written in clinical block letters across the front. "I requested this as part of the adoption research," Thomas explained, his voice unusually subdued, standard procedure when family history is unclear. "But Clara," he paused, running a hand through his silver hair, "the results show something we didn't expect." Clara's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope and withdrew the official laboratory report. The scientific language meant little to her, percentages and probabilities expressed in terms she didn't understand. But the summary at the bottom was written in plain English that hit her like a physical blow. Subject exhibits genetic markers consistent with maternal Hispanic ancestry. Familial DNA match probability. 87.3% grandchild relationship to Maria. Elena Santos, deceased. The report slipped from Clara's fingers, fluttering to the floor like a leaf torn from its branch. Maria Santos, the woman whose photograph had haunted Clara's prayers for 40 years. The mother who had stood at this very door with her son Miguel, seeking shelter that Clara had been too afraid to provide. "How is this possible?" Clara whispered, though even as she asked the question, pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. Thomas retrieved the report, his expression grave. "I did more research after we got these results. Miguel Santos survived that night. Barely. He was found with his mother, unconscious from hypothermia, but alive. The newspapers got it wrong, or maybe the information was confused in the chaos. He lived, Clara. He grew up, joined the military, served overseas." Clara felt the room spinning around her, 40 years of guilt and assumption crumbling beneath the weight of this new truth. "He lived?" "He did. Served 2 tours in Afghanistan, came home, had a daughter. Her name was Linda Santos Williams. She took her husband's name when she married, but he died in a car accident when Tasha was 2. Linda raised her alone until she got sick and died," Clara finished, the cosmic symmetry of it stealing her breath. "And Tasha came here because somehow, despite everything, this child found her way back to the place where her grandfather once sought help, where you turned them away 40 years ago." Clara sank into the nearest chair, her 70-year-old body suddenly feeling ancient. The weight of divine providence or cosmic justice pressed down on her shoulders like lead. All these years she had carried the guilt of 2 deaths that had never occurred, at least not the way she had believed. Miguel had lived, had grown up, had become a father himself. But he had also died eventually. Thomas's research had revealed that much. A roadside bomb in Kandahar province had taken his life 6 years ago, leaving Linda to raise Tasha alone. Until illness claimed her too. "There's more," Thomas said gently, producing another envelope from his briefcase. "I contacted the cemetery where Maria Santos is buried. Her sister, Rosa, has been maintaining the grave for decades. She never knew what happened that night, why Maria and Miguel were found where they were. When I explained about Tasha, she wanted me to give you this." The envelope was old, yellowed around the edges, addressed in careful handwriting to the Sisters of St. Agatha Convent. Clara's hands shook as she opened it, withdrawing a letter dated October 17th, 1983, 2 days after that terrible night. The words were written in Spanish, with an English translation attached in more recent handwriting. "To the Holy Sisters, my name is Maria Santos. 2 nights ago, I came to your door with my son Miguel when we had nowhere else to go. The sister who answered was kind, but could not help us. I do not blame her. We must have looked dangerous in the darkness, desperate people who might bring trouble. I want you to know that we found shelter that night. An old man named Joseph, who was walking his dog, saw us near the church and took us to the shelter on Oak Street. They had room because someone had left just that morning. Miguel is safe and warm, and I have found work cleaning offices downtown. I write this letter to thank the sister who answered our door, even though she could not help. She looked at us with kindness, not judgment. In her eyes I saw sorrow for our situation, not fear. That kindness gave me strength to keep trying, to keep believing that there were good people in the world who cared about strangers. I am sorry if we frightened you. I hope someday I can come back when things are better for my family, when we are not so desperate, and show you that your kindness was not wasted on people who had given up hope. With gratitude and prayers for your continued service to others, Maria Elena Santos P.S. If anything should ever happen to me, I have told Miguel that there are good people in this world, like the sister with the gentle eyes who wished she could help us. I've told him that such people will always find a way to do what is right. Clara read the letter twice before the words fully penetrated her understanding. Maria had not died that night. She had found shelter, found work, found hope. The newspaper clipping that had tormented Clara for 4 decades had been about different people, other victims of poverty and desperation in a city full of both. The real Maria Santos died 15 years later, Thomas said quietly. Cancer, according to Rosa. But she raised Miguel, saw him graduate high school, watched him marry. She lived long enough to hold her granddaughter when Tasha was born. Clara felt something breaking apart inside her chest. Not her heart, but the carapace of guilt that had encased it for so long. 40 years of penance for deaths that had never happened. 40 years of self-imposed exile from the kind of love that might have led her to marriage and children of her own. The waste of it felt overwhelming, but looking at Tasha through the window, watching the child help Sister Margaret hang laundry on the lines stretched between winter bare trees, Clara began to understand a different kind of providence at work. Perhaps she had needed those 40 years of preparation, of learning to serve and love without expectation of return. Perhaps Maria's granddaughter had needed to come to the very place where her family's story had begun, where kindness had been offered even when practical help could not be given. "Does Rosa want to see Tasha?" Clara asked. "She's elderly, living in a nursing home in San Antonio, but she's been praying for years that Maria's granddaughter would find stability and love. When I told her about your situation, she cried." Thomas paused, consulting his notes. "She said Maria always believed that the sister with gentle eyes would find a way to help their family someday, even though it hadn't been possible that first night." That afternoon, Clara and Tasha walked to Graceland Cemetery, where Maria Santos rested beneath a simple headstone maintained by loving hands. Rosa had sent flowers, white lilies that spoke of resurrection and hope. Clara knelt beside the grave, while Tasha arranged the flowers with careful attention to symmetry. "Was she my grandma's mama?" Tasha asked, reading the dates carved into granite. Her grandmother, yes, a very brave woman who loved her family and never gave up hope that they would find their way to safety. Tasha considered this with the seriousness she brought to all matters of family history. "Do you think she knows that I found you, that her wish came true?" Clara looked at this child who had somehow traveled across decades and circumstances to arrive at the very door where her great-grandmother had once sought help. The circular nature of it felt less like coincidence than like completion. A story that had waited 40 years to reach its proper conclusion. "I think she knows," Clara said, her voice steady with newfound certainty. "I think she's been watching over you, guiding you to where you belonged all along." That evening, as Clara helped Tasha prepare for bed, she found herself holding Maria's letter like a talisman, The sister with gentle eyes who wished she could help. Perhaps she had been helping all along in ways she had been too blinded by guilt to recognize. Perhaps every prayer she had offered for forgiveness, every act of service she had performed in penance, had been preparing her for this moment when love would knock on her door again, not in the form of a desperate stranger, but as family coming. Home. Maria's final letter had never been delivered, found 40 years later in a shoebox of legal documents that Rosa Santos had kept in her nursing home closet. The envelope bore the same careful handwriting as the first letter, but this one was addressed simply to Clara, with no surname or location, a message written to someone Maria had never met, but somehow knew would need its words someday. Thomas had driven to San Antonio to meet Rosa personally, understanding that some conversations required the weight of physical presence. The 90-year-old woman had pressed the letter into his hands with fingers twisted by arthritis, but still strong with purpose. "She wrote this a month before she died," Rosa had whispered. "Said someday the sister with gentle eyes would need to know that forgiveness was never hers to seek because none had ever been needed." Now Clara held that letter in the pre-dawn darkness of her cell, reading Maria's words by lamplight while the rest of the convent slept. "Dear Clara, I do not know your last name, but I have carried your face in my memory for 15 years. You were the young sister who answered the door that terrible night when Miguel and I had nowhere else to go. I saw the sorrow in your eyes when you could not help us, the way your hand lingered on the doorframe as if you wanted to reach out, but could not. I need you to know that your kindness saved us that night, even though you could not give us shelter. The gentleness in your voice when you suggested the shelter on Maple Street, the way you looked at Miguel as if you saw a child who deserved protection rather than a burden to be turned away. That kindness gave me strength to keep trying when I was ready to give up. We did find help that night. A man named Joseph found us walking toward the shelter and carried Miguel when his small legs could go no further. The shelter had room because someone else had found different help earlier that day. We were warm and safe and fed, and in the Yashai morning I found work that let me provide for my son. But more than that, your face reminded me that there was still goodness in the world, still people who cared about strangers even when they could not help them. I taught Miguel about that kindness, told him that when he grew up he should try to be like the sister who wished she could do more, but did what she could. If you are reading this, it means God has found a way to complete the circle of love that began that night at your door. I have prayed every day for 15 years that you would know you are not someone who failed us, but someone who helped save us. Your gentleness was the first step in our journey to safety. I am dying now, but I am not afraid because I have seen how love finds a way to continue even when we are gone. Take care of whatever child God has brought to your door and know that you are exactly the kind of person who deserves to be trusted with someone precious. With love and gratitude for kindness that lasted a lifetime, Maria Elena Santos. P.S. I have told Miguel and his daughter Linda about the sister with gentle eyes. If anything ever happens to bring my family back to your door, please know they come not as strangers seeking charity, but as family coming home. Clara folded the letter carefully, her hands steadier than they had been in weeks. The weight of 40 years of unnecessary guilt was lifting from her shoulders, replaced by something lighter, but no less profound, the responsibility of love freely given and gracefully received. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following week, and the legal obstacles had multiplied like weeds in untended ground. Social services had raised concerns about Clara's age and recent health issues. The diocesan office was reluctant to approve such an unconventional arrangement. A distant cousin of Tasha's had emerged from Milwaukee, claiming family rights despite Never having met the child, Mrs. Henderson had tried to prepare them for disappointment. The system tends to favor traditional placements, she had explained during their last meeting. Two-parent homes, younger caregivers, biological connections. When they exist, your case is compelling, but it's also unprecedented. Thomas worked 18-hour days preparing their legal strategy, consulting with family law specialists across the country, building a case that balanced emotional truth with legal precedent. The dining room of the convent had been transformed into a war room, covered with documents and legal briefs and character references from everyone who had witnessed Clara and Tasha's bond. "We need to be realistic about our chances," Thomas had warned during one late-night strategy session. "The judge will be looking at this case through the lens of legal guidelines that favor conventional family structures. We're asking him to make an exception based on intangible qualities, love, belonging, spiritual connection. Those are harder to quantify in legal terms, but the community had begun to mobilize around their case with the quiet determination of people who recognized justice when they saw it. Rosa Martinez, the young teacher from the parish school, had organized a letter-writing campaign. Parents whose children had been taught by the sisters wrote testimonials about their character and dedication. Father Miguel provided documentation of Clara's 40 years of service, her reputation for gentleness and wisdom in dealing with children who came to the church seeking comfort. Even some of Tasha's potential foster families had written letters supporting Clara's petition. The Johnsons, despite their disappointment at not being chosen, testified to the obvious bond they had witnessed between sister and child. The Garcias wrote movingly about how Tasha had spoken of Clara during her visit, the child's face lighting up whenever she mentioned the sister who taught her about plants and prayers. The night before the hearing, Clara found herself unable to sleep. She walked through the convent's quiet corridors, past the chapel where she had prayed for forgiveness for so many years, past the garden where she had taught Tasha to coax life from winter soil, past the kitchen where Sister Margaret was already preparing for the early morning routine that anchored their days. In Tasha's room, she found the child awake as well, sitting up in bed with Mr. Patches in her arms and moonlight streaming through the small window. Tasha's face was serious but unafraid, as if she had inherited her great-grandmother's faith that love would find a way to prevail even in uncertain circumstances. "Are you scared about tomorrow?" Clara asked, settling carefully on the edge of the narrow bed. "A little bit," Tasha admitted, "but Mr. Patches says everything will be okay because we belong together. He says some things are so right that even grown-ups can see it." Clara smoothed the child's hair with gentle fingers, marveling at the wisdom that often came from the mouths of those too young to understand why the world made things complicated. "What do you think makes us belong together?" Tasha considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all matters of importance. "You need me to help you remember how to laugh, and I need you to help me remember how to feel safe, and we both need each other to make the sad parts less heavy." The simple truth of it took Clara's breath away. This child understood what 40 years of theological study had never quite made clear, that love was not about deserving or earning, but about recognizing the pieces of ourselves that had been waiting in other people, the healing that could only happen when broken parts found their complements. They prayed together as they had every night since Tasha's arrival, the child's small voice joining Clara's in words that had sustained generations of believers through uncertainty and fear. But tonight, their prayers felt different. Not pleas for divine intervention, but expressions of gratitude for grace already received, acknowledgement that they had been entrusted with something precious that transcended legal definitions of family. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Clara said as she tucked the covers around Tasha's small form, "remember that you are loved completely and forever. That doesn't change because of what judges decide or papers they sign. Love is bigger than the rules, people. Make about it. Tasha nodded solemnly, then reached under her pillow and withdrew her mother's locket, the silver heart that contained the photograph of her infant self. Mama told me once that love never really goes away. It just finds new ways to take care of people. I think she sent me here so you could take care of me and I could take care of you. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks, not the bitter tears of regret she had shed for so many years, but the sweet tears of recognition. This child carried her great-grandmother's wisdom, her grandfather's resilience, her mother's capacity for hope. But more than that, she carried the future, a chance for the story that began with desperate knocking on a convent door to finally reach the ending it had always deserved. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the edges of the horizon. In a few hours, they would walk into a courtroom where strangers would decide the shape of their future. But here, in this quiet moment, surrounded by the peace of the convent that had sheltered them both, Clara felt something she had not experienced. In 40 years of seeking, the absolute certainty that love, patient, persistent, transformative love, would ultimately prevail. The judge's gavel rested on the bench like a small wooden hammer of destiny, its polished surface reflecting the fluorescent lights of Cook County Family Court. Judge Patricia Hernandez was a woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too many broken families to maintain illusions about perfect solutions. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her adherence to legal precedent, making her both the best and worst possible choice to hear their case. Clara sat in the front row between Thomas and Mother Superior, her hands folded in her lap, with the stillness that came from 40 years of prayer. She wore her best habit, the one reserved for solemn occasions, its crisp white wimple framing a face that showed every one of her 70 years. Beside her, Tasha sat with unusual quiet, Mr. Patches held securely in her arms, her small legs swinging from the adult-sized chair. The courtroom was fuller than Clara had expected. Rosa Martinez sat with several parents from the parish school. Father Miguel occupied a seat near the back, his weathered hands clasped over his prayer book. Even some of the sisters from neighboring convents had come, their presence a silent testimony to the bonds that connected their scattered communities. "This is an unusual case," Judge Hernandez began, reading from the file that contained the legal summary of their situation. "We have a petition for adoption by a 70-year-old unmarried woman who has never been a legal guardian, requesting custody of a 6-year-old child to whom she has no biological connection. The petitioner resides in a religious community not licensed for childcare, and the child has living relatives who have expressed interest in custody." Thomas rose to present their case, his silver hair catching the courtroom lights as he moved to the podium with the measured confidence of someone who had spent 40 years arguing before judges. Clara felt a surge of gratitude for the brother who had traveled across the country and across decades of emotional distance to stand with her in this moment. "Your Honor, this case is indeed unusual, but it represents something the law has always recognized, that the best interests of the child must take precedence over conventional arrangements. Tasha Williams has been living at St. Agatha's Convent for 3 months, during which time she has formed profound bonds with Sister Clara McKenna and the community of women who have dedicated their lives to service." The opposing counsel, representing Tasha's distant cousin from Milwaukee, was a young man with earnest eyes and a briefcase full of statistics about traditional family structures. When his turn came, he spoke eloquently about the advantages of a 2-parent household, the importance of age-appropriate caregivers, and the child's need for stability that a conventional family could better provide. "Robert Williams is Tasha's second cousin," he argued. "He and his wife have been married for 12 years, have 2 children of their own, and can provide Tasha with siblings, financial security, and caregivers who will likely survive to see her reach adulthood. While we respect Sister McKenna's dedication to the child's welfare, the reality is that at 70, with recent health issues, she may not be able to provide the long-term stability that Tasha requires. Clara felt each word like a physical blow, even though she had prepared herself for such arguments. The lawyer was not wrong. She was old, her health was uncertain, and the convent was an unconventional environment for raising a child. In purely practical terms, the case for placement with Robert Williams was compelling, but when Mrs. Henderson was called to testify about Tasha's adjustment and emotional state, the picture became more complex. In my 20 years as a social worker, I have rarely seen a child integrate so completely into a living situation, she told the court. Tasha has thrived at the convent in ways that surprised all of us. Her nightmares have decreased, her academic performance has improved, and she has formed attachments that appear to be genuinely healing rather than merely dependent. Father Miguel's testimony focused on Clara's character and the convent's long history of community service. Sister Clara has been a pillar of our parish for 4 decades, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had counseled hundreds of families through crisis. I have watched her interact with children who come to our church seeking comfort or guidance. She has a rare gift for understanding what young people need, for providing both gentle discipline and unconditional acceptance. The character witnesses painted a picture of the convent as a place of stability and purpose, where Tasha had found not just shelter, but belonging. Rosa Martinez spoke about watching Tasha help in the parish school garden, her patience with younger children, and her obvious pride in the work she did alongside Clara. She talks about Sister Clara the way children talk about beloved grandmothers, Rosa testified, with complete trust, deep affection, and the security that comes from knowing someone loves you exactly as you are. When the time came for Tasha's testimony, Judge Hernandez spoke directly to the child with the gentle manner of someone who understood that children often saw truth more clearly than adults. Tasha, can you tell me about living at the convent? What is it like there? Tasha's voice was small but clear as she described her daily routine, helping in the garden, learning to read with Sister Rose, cooking with Sister Margaret, and the evening prayers she shared with Clara. Her words painted a picture of a life rich with purpose and connection, where she was not just cared for, but valued as an essential part of the community. Do you want to stay at the convent with Sister Clara? Judge Hernandez asked gently, her stern demeanor softening as she addressed the child. Tasha nodded, clutching Mr. Patches closer to her chest. Yes, ma'am. Sister Clara needs me to help her remember how to smile, and I need her to help me feel safe when I have scary dreams about my mama being gone. And what about meeting your cousin Robert and his family? Would you like to visit them? Tasha considered this with the careful thought she brought to all important questions. I think they're probably very nice people, but Sister Clara is my family now. She knows about my mama's mama, and she teaches me prayers in Irish like her mama taught her. We're connected in a special way that God made happen. The simple wisdom of the child's words seemed to fill the courtroom with a different kind of testimony. Not legal arguments or expert opinions, but the voice of the person most affected by the decision speaking truth from the heart. When Clara was called to speak on her own behalf, she rose slowly, feeling the weight of 70 years and the hopes of a lifetime converging in this moment. She looked at Tasha, then at the judge, and began to speak in the clear, measured voice that had sustained her through decades of prayer and service. Your Honor, I will not pretend that I am the ideal guardian for Tasha in conventional terms. I am old. I live in a religious community that has never raised children, and I cannot promise that I will live to see her graduate from college. But I can promise something else, that she will be loved completely, that she will learn to find purpose in serving others, and that she will grow up surrounded by women who have dedicated their lives to understanding what really matters." Clara paused, her eyes finding Thomas in the front row, then continued with growing strength. "3 months ago, when Tasha knocked on our door, I thought God was giving me a chance to atone for a past failure. But I have come to understand that this is not about my redemption. It is about recognizing family when it appears in unexpected forms. This child and I belong together not because it makes practical sense, but because love transcends the categories we use to organize our lives." Thomas then presented Maria's letters and the DNA evidence, explaining the remarkable chain of connections that had brought Tasha to the very place where her great-grandmother had once sought help. The cosmic nature of the coincidence was not lost on Judge Hernandez, whose eyebrows rose as she examined the documentation. "So you're telling me," the judge said slowly, "that this child is descended from a woman who came to Sister McKenna's convent 40 years ago, and that Sister McKenna has been carrying guilt about that encounter for 4 decades. "Yes, Your Honor," Thomas replied. "Maria Santos's letter makes it clear that Sister Clara's kindness, even when she couldn't provide shelter, gave Maria the strength to continue seeking help. In a very real sense, Sister Clara's compassion that night contributed to saving Maria. And her son Miguel, Tasha's grandfather." The judge studied the letters, her expression thoughtful. "And the family in Milwaukee, Mr. Williams, how does he respond to this information?" Robert Williams had driven down from Milwaukee with his wife and 2 teenage children, a well-dressed family that radiated suburban stability. When called upon to speak, he stood with obvious reluctance. "Your Honor, I had never heard of Tasha until social services contacted me 6 weeks ago. I'm willing to provide a home for her. She is family after all, but I can't claim to have the kind of connection that Sister McKenna has clearly developed." He glanced at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. "After listening to the testimony today, after seeing how Tasha responds to Sister Clara, I think perhaps the best interests of this child lie not with legal definitions of family, but with the people who have already become her family." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this unexpected concession. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized that even the opposition had been moved by the evidence of love and belonging they had witnessed. Judge Hernandez called for a brief recess, during which she retired to chambers to consider the unprecedented nature of the case. Clara found herself surrounded by supporters, their quiet words of encouragement forming a cocoon of hope around her and Tasha. When court reconvened, the judge's expression was grave, but not unkind. She looked at each party, Robert Williams and his family, Mrs. Henderson, Thomas, and finally Clara and Tasha, before beginning to speak. "In 40 years on the bench, I have never seen a case quite like this one. We have a child who has found stability and love in an unconventional setting, biological family willing to step aside in her best interests, and compelling evidence that sometimes what we call coincidence might be something deeper." Clara held her breath, feeling Tasha's small hand slip into hers with the trust of someone who believed that love would ultimately triumph over bureaucracy. The law exists to protect children, not to enforce artificial definitions of what families should look like. I have seen traditional 2-parent households where children suffer neglect and abuse, and I have seen unconventional arrangements where children thrive beyond all expectations. The judge picked up her gavel, its weight symbolic of the authority she wielded over their future. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, I find that the best interests of Tasha Marie Williams are served by granting the petition for adoption. Sister Clara McKenna, You are hereby granted full legal custody and parental rights, with the understanding that the court will conduct periodic reviews to ensure continued stability and appropriate care. The gavel fell with a sound that seemed to echo through Clara's entire life. 40 years of guilt and penance transformed in an instant into the legal recognition of a love that had always transcended documentation. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration, tears and embraces and whispered prayers of gratitude. Tasha looked up at Clara with eyes bright with joy and relief. "Does this mean I get to stay forever?" "Forever and always, sweetheart," Clara whispered, gathering the child into her arms with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had finally learned the difference between love and fear. "You're my daughter now, legally, and in every way that matters." As they walked from the courtroom, Clara felt Maria Santos's presence like a benediction, not the ghost of guilt that had haunted her prayers for decades, but the spirit of a great-grandmother, watching her descendant find the safety and love she had always deserved. The circle that had begun with desperate knocking on a convent door was finally complete, sealed with a judge's decree and witnessed by a community that understood that sometimes the most important families are the ones we choose to create. The new family photograph sat on Clara's desk in a simple wooden frame that Thomas had carved with his own hands, a skill inherited from their father, but refined through years of finding solace in small acts of creation. In the picture, Clara and Tasha stood in the convent garden surrounded by late spring flowers, with Thomas beaming behind them, his hands resting protectively on both their shoulders. It was a portrait of belonging that transcended traditional definitions, three people who had found their way to each other through paths marked by loss and redemption. 6 months had passed since the adoption decree was signed, and the rhythm of their days had settled into the comfortable cadence of established family life. Tasha's room, no longer the guest quarters but truly her own space, was decorated with drawings she had made of the convent and its inhabitants, watercolor portraits of each sister engaged in their daily work, and a special corner shrine where she kept her mother's locket alongside a small statue of St. Agatha that Sister Rose had given her for her 7th birthday. Clara's health had improved dramatically, as if the resolution of her long-carried guilt had freed her body to remember how to be strong. The cardiologist attributed her progress to reduced stress and increased purpose, but Clara knew the real medicine had been love, the kind that flowed both ways, nourishing the giver as much as the receiver. Her morning walks with Tasha through the neighborhood had become a cherished routine. The child's endless questions about plants and people and the workings of the world keeping Clara engaged with life in ways she had forgotten were possible. Other sisters had embraced their roles as aunts with the enthusiasm of women who had always had maternal instincts but few opportunities to express them. Sister Margaret taught Tasha to bake bread on Saturdays, her arthritic hands guiding small fingers through the ancient alchemy of flour and water and yeast. Sister Anne helped with homework, her careful attention to numbers and letters revealing a patience that surprised everyone, including herself. Sister Rose, despite her advancing age, read stories aloud with the dramatic flair of someone who had always believed that tales came alive through the voice of the teller. Mother Superior Mary Catherine had proven to be the most surprising aunt of all, her stern administrative exterior melting in Tasha's presence to reveal a woman with a gift for seeing the world through a child's eyes. She had converted one corner of her office into a play area where Tasha could retreat during the sisters' business meetings, filling it with books and puzzles and art supplies that appeared as if by magic whenever the child expressed interest. In new activities, Thomas had become a regular presence in their lives, driving down from Boston every few weeks to spend time with his new niece and reconnect with the sister he had lost touch with decades ago. His visits brought gifts both practical and whimsical, school supplies and winter coats, but also books about brave girls and strong women, art sets that encouraged creativity, and a child-sized toolkit so Tasha could help him with the small repair projects that always seemed to emerge during his stays. "She's changed you," Thomas had observed during his most recent visit, watching Clara and Tasha work together in the garden, their voices blending in conversation about which plants needed water and which were ready for harvesting. "You're more yourself than I've seen you since we were children in Cork." Clara had considered his words while watching Tasha carefully transplant seedlings, her small hands gentle but confident with the green growing things. Perhaps Thomas was right. Perhaps becoming Tasha's mother had allowed her to reclaim parts of herself that had been buried under years of penance and self-imposed isolation. The young woman who had dreamed of children and laughter and a house full of love had not disappeared entirely. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. The parish school had welcomed Tasha with open arms, her quick mind and kind heart making her a favorite among both teachers and classmates. Rosa Martinez had taken special interest in her academic progress, recognizing in the child the same resilience that had allowed her great-grandmother Maria to survive and thrive despite overwhelming obstacles. Tasha's essays about family often featured the sisters as central characters, their daily acts of service and devotion portrayed with the clear-eyed admiration of someone who understood that heroism came in many forms. The community support that had sustained them through the adoption process had evolved into something deeper, a network of friends and extended family that included everyone from the mailman who always had a joke for Tasha to the grocery store owner who saved the best apples for their weekly shopping trips. The convent had become less insular, more connected to the neighborhood around it, as if Tasha's presence had reminded everyone that religious communities existed not to separate themselves from the world, but to serve it more effectively. On quiet evenings, when the other sisters had retired to their cells for evening prayers, and the convent settled into its peaceful night rhythm, Clara and Tasha would often visit the small cemetery behind the chapel, where generations of sisters rested. Beneath simple stone markers, they had planted a memorial garden there, with flowers that bloomed in succession from early spring through late fall, ensuring that there was always something beautiful to mark the passage of seasons and years. It was during one such visit that Tasha asked the question Clara had been expecting. "Do you think my mama knows about all of this? About how I found you and how we're a family now?" Clara looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, points of light that had witnessed countless human stories of loss and love and redemption. "I think she knows, sweetheart. I think she and your great-great-grandmother Maria are both watching over us, happy that their family has found a place to grow and flourish." Tasha nodded with the acceptance of someone who had learned early that love transcends the boundaries between earth and heaven, that the people who shape us continue their influence long after they have moved beyond our physical reach. She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the newest grave marker, Sister Catherine from the neighboring convent who had died the previous month, and whispered a prayer in the mixture of English and Irish that had become their family language. Walking back toward the warm lights of the convent, Clara felt the deep satisfaction that comes from understanding that some stories, no matter how long and complicated their journey, eventually find their way to the endings they were always meant to. 40 years ago, desperate knocking had awakened her to the reality of her own limitations and fears. Today, love had knocked again, not in desperation but in recognition, and this time Clara had been ready to answer with her whole heart. Behind them, the memorial garden rustled with the soft sounds of night settling over growing things, and, somewhere in that gentle symphony, Clara thought she heard the echo of ancient blessings passed down through generations of women who had learned that the most important families are often the ones we choose to create, tend, and nurture into full bloom.